Alright, welcome back to Moonstruck right here on Riot Radio. I'm your host Orion, and today we're going to be talking about the essence of destruction and creation, kind of this cycle that occurs pretty much in every aspect of existence. And, we're going to be drawing some parallels just to, some animes, of course, because I always find that it's helpful to kind of illustrate what we're talking about through something in which we can actually visualize it, because a lot of times it's somewhat challenging to conceptualize a lot of these concepts without some kind of visual medium to act as assistance. So today we're going to, maybe make a couple references to Dragon Ball and some anime, but we're going to start off essentially talking about what is the aspect of this in itself as something. And I think the concept of destruction is actually a force that overlaps with a lot of other aspects that we talk about in spirituality. Like, we talk about the concept of rebirth, or concept of transformation, or concept of death and life. Those are all like kind of overlapping subjects with destruction. Almost you can think of destruction being the main primary force, and death and the absence of light, or darkness, all kind of fall under that aspect of destruction. In Dragon Ball, for instance, they say destruction comes before creation, right? And you can view it as the other way around too, that creation will also precede destruction in some sense as well, because of course we're talking about one cycle, two heads of the same coin, right? Or almost yin and yang, right? Two forces that really give that energy, or that cycle, its very state of being. So understanding it from the perspective that this is really one subject we're talking about, but it's represented through different aspects, is the kind of main concept here. So I feel like when we, talk about destruction, or we talk about the aspect of death or rebirth, sometimes it gets kind of, I wouldn't say tainted, but misrepresented, because we often think about this as the, negative side of things. We often associate light and life with the more positive aspects, but that's not necessarily accurate, because both are necessary for the maintainment of order. So when we talk about order, or a state of balance, we're really talking about both these forces operating in harmony together. So if that really is how we are seeking to transform ourselves, or apply that mentality back into life, we have to kind of view it objectively, and view it as it should be in its respective characteristics, and kind of not taint that with our own viewpoint of negative, positive, good, bad, and like kind of all these aspects of duality, which are not really innate to the concept in itself. So of course, as I said, when we're talking about metaphysics, or when we're talking about these concepts, it is something that is challenging to conceptualize when we're talking about something that is not so physical. We can visualize it in some sense. You might be able to think of some of these aspects, such as the seasons changing and affecting trees losing their leaves, or them blossoming in spring. We're about to see the the trees blossom sometime soon. So we can think of it in that sense, and we can draw these parallels, but in of itself, a thing in which you can visualize, it's not always clear. So especially the concept of destruction, are often associated with darkness. It's kind of the voidness of life, or light, right? It's the absence of light. It's the absence of the thing that kind of defines everything here in the physical realm. So like pretty much everything in this room is a construct of light in some sense, right? And pretty interesting actually to note that in science it does say that most of the universe is actually dark. it's made out of dark matter and dark energy, and these invisible and absent from view forces in which we cannot see or touch or interact with in any way. So when we talk about the energy of destruction, or the energy of death, or the absence of life, or the absence of light, the absence of the force of creation, we're really talking about a lot of these concepts that overlap with this. So just interesting to think about in that perspective, because this is really a deep concept, and it's not something I would say that I'm an expert in by any means. I'm just seeking to understand this like everyone else. And even I would say, to my to just kind of admit with myself, like, my knowledge about this, I'm no expert here, because I'm still learning more about this subject currently. I often find that these subjects are very interesting to look into, but obviously, like, continuing to learn more through being interested in the subject is where you can kind of really lead to more growth and to more expansion on that subject being understood. So that's kind of the overarching premise. I would say that topics that I've reviewed in the past were a bit more physical in nature, and therefore I have a bit more of a clear understanding with them, but I'll do my best to I would say allude to the aspects that define this as much as I can. So maybe we'll actually go to the first image up there. And so, for instance, in Dragon Ball, they refer to this energy of destruction as Hakai. And essentially what that means is it translates from Japanese into English as destruction. So essentially we're talking about the ability to dematerialize anything and turn it back into a force that is almost beyond light, or cosmic energy, right? So here, let me take a sip of tea. It's a very deep subject to get into. So Hakai is essentially the ability to dematerialize anything and erase it out of existence completely. And this is kind of similar to how sometimes we talk about things being erased from the timeline, for instance, right? You think of like paradoxes such as like the grandfather paradox, which I talk about in science, where if you were to go back in time and kill your like ancestor or great ancestor, then you would not be created in the first place, meaning you would like not exist to travel back in time, which is kind of paradoxical. But say that could play out in an event where it would not create a temporal loop. Essentially, you have yourself being erased from existence to some degree, right? The very essence which builds up your being, or tethers you to that timeline, or that causality of events, does not occur. So here it's a similar principle, but obviously we're not going back in time or changing anything with the timeline to cause this event. It's simply the act of dematerializing something in the present moment and saying that, okay, this thing is being removed out of existence entirely. And it's even said in the lore of Dragon Ball that somebody who gets hit by Hakai energy essentially is erased out of existence. There's no afterlife, there's no other world, there's no essentially any aspect of continuation after somebody's been hit by this energy of destruction. So an understanding that this maybe might act as a great parallel to what we're talking about, but make no mistake, this episode it's not about Dragon Ball. It's using Dragon Ball to allude to a greater subject, which is what I'm trying to do here, or attempting to do, rather. So, again, we're essentially talking about a very metaphysical concept that is very deeply ingrained into what we are. If you think of even how we got here in the first place. I'm not talking about really how human beings have come to exist on Earth, but just how we actually grow. Like, we start as like one cell or one embryo, and like we evolve into this like whole being. And if you think of that, that's the aspect of life going around, right? And the aspect of death or destruction, or the opposite force or the contrasting force to that, is essentially a process in which that can almost be reversed. Not in the sense where you're growing backwards or growing in some other sense, but in a sense where all the intricate pieces that manifest your being here can be dematerialized or destroyed in some sense, where the very information is kind of erased out of the cosmos. So to draw a parallel back to something we can conceptualize or is actually science-based, we can almost think of it as black holes, right? You can think of black holes as things that destroy information, even though we've actually proven now that black holes do not destroy information, because the information that they supposedly destroy is actually imprinted on a different dimension in the cosmos. And that was kind of evaluated by Stephen Hawking and Kip Thorne's book titled The Black Hole War, which they were actually debating whether the information in black holes is destroyed. And due to a concept in physics known as conservation of information, they found that it does not, in fact, destroy the information, but in fact it is imprinted on the universe or on the cosmos in some sense. So even though, there has this whole process of spaghettifying the matter that falls into the singularity, and then irradiating away an equal amount of radiation or equal amount of energy, the information is still existing in some kind of quantum state. So the energy is not completely destroyed. In this, we're talking about a similar concept. So I would say, black holes draw an interesting parallel to almost this energy of destruction, and almost a much-needed force when it comes to the overall balance of the cosmos. If you think of it, that black holes I'm referring to is one of the most, predominant forces in the solar system, or in the dynamics of the solar system, or should I say the galaxy, because at the heart of every galaxy, like Sagittarius A, for example, which is our galaxy, there is a black hole at the center of it, a supermassive black hole actually, in which all of us are actually right now caught in its gravitational field to a degree. As we know, gravitational fields weaken as you get further away from the source, but essentially you're moving in relativity to this force that has the ability to, in a sense, destroy everything it comes into contact with, or at least change it into a different state in which it can no longer exist in the physical dimension, which is kind of the same concept we're talking about here, except we're talking about the ability to erase something out of existence and just almost dematerialize it in a sense. So there's kind of a lot we don't know about what really happens when you attempt to erase information from the cosmos, because you can even think of when a person dies, for example, that information it's not gone, it's just transferred into a different state. You're powered by electromagnetic energy that surrounds your body, and so the question of all this stuff with ghosts and apparitions has always been, okay, if the physical body dies and there's a energy field that surrounds a body, then when the physical meat suit dies, when all the organs are no longer required, when that energy leaves this state of being, where does it go, right? So, but with this, what we're talking about here, energy of destruction, essentially we're talking about that no longer is a concept. Essentially everything from the very physical to the very spirit-based is wiped out completely. So that's an interesting concept, because that means that it does not go into a quantum state, is not transferred into another dimension of hyperspace or whatever. It is not essentially able to go to some other realm or afterlife or netherworld or whatever. It's just simply gone. So that is a concept in which physics actually has a very difficult time trying to interpret and understand, and that's why they have this principle in physics known as the conservation of information, and which is why, actually, spoiler alert for the Black Hole War book, if you want to read the book and you don't want spoilers, cover your ears, but essentially Kip Thorne was actually the physicist who beat Stephen Hawking in this battle of debating what happens to the information or the matter that falls into a black hole. Even though it was related to his principle around Hawking radiation, and his theory is still correct, but concerning the information that is imprinted or saved in some sense, Stephen Hawking was saying it destroys all the information, there's no trace. And Kip Thorne is saying, well, physics says, that can't happen. There's a principle that says all that information must be stored somewhere, right? And they found out that it's kind of tied to this holographic principle in which everything in the cosmos is actually imprinted on the fabric of the universe or the fabric of the cosmos in some way, in a quantum state or in some kind of dimension of hyperspace. So he goes over some interesting thought experiments actually coming to this conclusion around how that information is stored and what happens as you approach the black hole and the information is, or the matter is approaching the black hole, such as he goes into stuff like gravitational redshift, which is essentially when something is approaching the black hole, it seems to lose all its energy in a sense, because the light is almost infinitely shifting to the red end of the spectrum because it is losing all its energy. As we know, the blue end of the spectrum, the light spectrum, is a very energetic, high energy source, and the red side is the side that loses all its energy, and also means that the energy is moving away from you or is decreasing in energy, right? So that's also how they can see what position stars are moving in. If a star is in red shift, that means it's moving away from you. If it's in blue shift, that means it's moving towards you, or it's losing energy or it's gaining energy in accordance to the observer, of course. So a lot of deep subjects here. I'm going to take a sip of tea because, again, this is a lot of talking. Yeah, I mean, it's not uncomplicated as a subject in itself when we talk about something so fundamental to nature, such as the process of creation and destruction. So when we talk about something deep like destruction, we're really talking about a force that is very beyond our almost ability to comprehend, because it precedes us in the universe. It pretty much precedes everything that is created within the universe, because it came from this state of nothing or the absence of being, right? And that's really what destruction is. It's really the absence of being. And they even refer to it as it's deciding whether what is in existence and not in existence, and that's the duality that it's seen with, in a sense. But essentially it's getting to this point where duality does not exist anymore as a concept. So that's why you kind of see this purple hue around the Hakai energy. You can almost associate that with the crown center, and this kind of goes into a little bit in what they say in the Bible about the Church of Laodicea, where one is neither hot nor cold, and since one is lukewarm, you're in this state of in-between duality, and you're able to kind of be at this state that is beyond life or death or creation or destruction or the very existence of things itself. You're at a state where everything is returning to that energetic state it was in before everything was created. So if if you're interested in this stuff, I'm sure you've heard the concept that everything is just energy. It's essentially the ability to transfer everything back into that energetic state. So it's not existing in connectivity with anything else. It's just existing as pure energy. So this is kind of what is portrayed in this series with the energy of destruction. Maybe we'll go to the next image there. Actually, let's go to the last image. Let's go to the last image. So here we see Lord Beerus, and his aura is glowing up here. But essentially his role in the show is essentially a destroyer. And the reason why this is kind of relevant, especially when we talk about like spirituality or whatever, or balance in the cosmos, is that sometimes destruction is needed, and that's how they kind of like determined it in the show, right? And he even jokes about what does he say in the show, that oh yeah, Earth is that planet where I wiped out those dinosaurs with those those temperamental issues, or those like essentially they were being rude, so he wiped them out, but he spared the planet, or something like that is what he says. But essentially Beerus is this destroyer god who is able to essentially wipe anything out of existence and essentially erasing it from ever existing in the first place. But it's kind of interesting to this storyline how every universe or every section of the cosmos which is described in this series, every universe has its own destroyer god, which kind of relates to the concept that destruction is a necessary aspect of reality, whether we realize it or not. All things are created, and all things leave creation at some point or another. So understanding that is a fundamental concept to everything is really the stepping stone to gateway of higher knowledge here we're talking about. Because when you start to think of things at that level of unity and seeing above that state of duality of like all these notions we have here on Earth, you're kind of getting to a higher state of understanding. And you can almost think of it like in a sense where, say for electric fields, right? Everything is a counterpart. You have a negative charge and you have a positive charge, and all of those things go together to create the unity, which is stable structures. There's an electric field around this, which ensures that the mug doesn't just explode, right? It stays in its state because there's a polarity that is going on between the charges that are around this mug, right? Same thing for the microphone or the wall, or the reason why nothing just combusts, because there's a equal or opposite polarity of forces that are in harmony to create the state that it's in, right? Same thing with magnetic fields, the main difference being in science that they say like electric fields you could separate charges. In magnetic fields they haven't discovered anything which would be known as a monopole, which is one pole existing by itself, right? There's always a north and a south together. So that's kind of the way that electric fields and magnetic fields kind of are shown to be different. But in a sense, it's that same concept that all these forces, creation and destruction, north, south, positive, negative, they all go together in a sense. And they all represent two different aspects of the same spectrum. So we're both talking about the same charge, right? And I feel like that's very important concept, because if you start to look at everything not as separate or not as different from one another, but in contrast to something else, you start to get a greater understanding for how things work in the cosmos. Einstein used to say that essentially everything is relative to one another, right? Depending on how you're moving, how fast you're moving through space and time, because essentially that determines how the fabric of this material is being bent or curved. So, That's why, things with time start to get a little wonky when you approach the speed of light. The space-time barrier or the space-time continuum starts to bend, right? And I don't know, just some wonky stuff goes on with space-time essentially when you're moving in a specific way. So understanding that if you think of things in a spectrum, okay, I'm not in movement right now, but if I start, going into movement, if I get up and walk across the room, how is that changing the energy in the field, right? Or how is that changing, the knock-on effect of something else, right? Is important, because you really come back to this concept of causality, and that being tied to how things are moving or how things are in transition, which is really how you understand anything that goes on in the world. Things you can only see in contrast to yourself. So there's a transition, or almost what they would refer to in consciousness as a refractory period when you talk about in reference to the way you're viewing the world, such as, like, for example, like if you talk to somebody and they upset you, and you're the amount of time it takes you to get back to the state you were in previously is called a refractory period. So that can happen with emotions, not just like physical movement or actions or the speed of light or whatever, but we're talking about here the nature of causality. We're talking about things and change, and that's essentially really the whole dynamic and greater concept behind creation and destruction. We're talking about two concepts that are always interlinked, two ends of the same spectrum. So when we talk about, in this case, light and dark, you can almost think of it like, on one side of the light spectrum you have red, and the other side you have blue, and beyond red you have black, in which there's no energy, and you can associate it with almost this energy of destruction. And on the other side you have blue, or indigo, or violet, or I should say blue, indigo, and purple. And essentially at that end beyond purple, you have white, and then that creates the whole entire light spectrum, right? So, and you can see that even if if you've ever done a science experiment where you've broken light apart using a pyramid, and you see all the different colors, you can see it goes, you don't see black, but it would go black, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, purple, and then it would go white when all the colors then are combined back together, right? Black is the absence of light, or all the colors actually together. White is also all the colors together, but it is it's them combined together, so it's tricky to explain, because when you perceive white, or when somebody say if I were wearing a white t-shirt, you're seeing like all the colors being reflected equally. But when you see black, there's no color reflected because it absorbs all the color. So black is essentially all the colors when it comes to perception, and white is essentially the absence of color when it comes to perception. But when it comes to the actual physics of it, white then becomes a combination of all the colors, and black becomes the absence of color. So it's really a complex subject when it comes to perception versus the actual physics of what is going on. But essentially, you can see how these concepts overlap and overlap and overlap, and it's really just the same concept that is, flipped over or turned backwards or upside down or whatever, but it's all really the same spectrum. And if you can figure out what energy in that situation is in relation to that other thing which you're trying to understand, then you have that spectrum to kind of correlate to something else, right? It's almost like when you can think of it like if you're trying to tune your instrument. Let's say you're on the piano, right? and you're looking for the note that sounds right, and you can hear it that, oh yeah, that's not the right note, but then you're playing a note that, you know, sounds close to that, and you can tell by that note being close to the note that you're looking for that, okay, maybe it's C is the note I'm looking for, and it's not, you know, it's not like D sharp or something or whatever, right? So you're talking about a concept that is based on something in relativity to something else, existence in relativity to non-existence, creation in relativity to destruction, and, you know, dark in relativity to light, whatever it is. You know, you're talking about concepts that have always been linked, but sometimes they're viewed differently or viewed as two separate things, but really they're not, they're one thing. So you're at, and like I said, at that point, you're really getting to a concept that is far beyond anything that is almost within the realm of being able to understand, because you're dealing with a very fundamental basis of things, where things come from somewhere, it comes from a state of energy, and they disappear into a state of energy. So that's pretty much the nature of the cosmos, you know. What did they say happened at the beginning of time? The Big Bang. So what happened before the Big Bang? What was there before the Big Bang? Well, I suppose there was nothing, right? Or there was a different state of energy. You know, science will say that the cosmos or the universe existed in almost a fiery heat state, in which the elements were in a different state of relativity to where they are now. And then, you know, this expansion happened and created pretty much the universe that we know, in which has the stars and has the planets and whatnot. But, you know, in a sense, what was outside of that hot state of all the elements being in that altered state? It was nothing. There was energy. It was pure energy. So this is a very primordial concept, you know, and the thing that I like about Dragon Ball, kind of using lore from even, you know, not just philosophy, in the sense where it relates to, you know, Goku and Vegeta, you know, using these energies themselves at points in the series, but in its relation to the concept of, like, say for example, angels, you know, like, you know, Whis is an angel, and they align that with the power of Ultra Instinct, and when they're talking about the energy of Beerus, or destroyer energy, you know, they relate that to Ultra Ego, and kind of the meaning behind that is that you essentially have these two sides of the same coin of approaching the same end result, you know, which is the ability to maneuver in battle, or the ability to apply yourself fully in battle. And of course the angel method is essentially based more on this state of being able to maneuver through this energy of creation by, you know, being able to operate from instinct alone, or impulse alone, electrical impulse alone, because, you know, all of us have electric current running through us, and the ability to think, this is the concept anyway, that when you think, you are reducing your ability to actually act innately on that impulse. And the reason for that is because, and, you know, I jokingly say this a lot of the time, but in a sense I'm somewhat serious, that thoughts should only be for fun. You know, you already know how to maneuver through yourself in every situation. You don't need to think it. It's already innately within you. The ability that you're looking for, or the thing that you need to master, is the ability to let go of expectation, let go of, you know, everything that like is a lingering thought in your mind, all your hesitations, all your anticipations of movement, everything that you think will happen, let that go, because thought is almost this distracting point from that innate being of knowing how to move through something, or understanding something that already exists inside you, you know. You can almost think of it as if all that information is already present in the state that you're in, because you know it's a possibility that can exist, you don't need to think it because that energy already exists. So essentially, the concept of that is that knowing that the thing that you could want to perform, or the way you want to perform, already exists in some state, thereby the ability of release, or the act of release to that thing, is the method in which you can unlock the potential to do that. I don't know if that made any sense, but essentially the concept which I'm getting across is that by releasing your attachment to that thing, you have more energy to actually perform the thing. And since that thing can be conceptualized, if it were to be conceptualized, then it is already in existence in some state. Especially at what physics would call the quantum state, everything is already a possibility. So that exact thing that you want to perform can be done in the way that you want it done if you release the ability so you can get it done, if that makes any sense. But anyway, that's essentially the case of ultra instinct. When we're talking about ultra ego, which is, the kind of counterpart to that, which is the energy of destruction, instead of releasing the ego and releasing your attachment to ego and releasing your attachment to the material world so you can move through it freely and uninhibited, this concept is connecting with your ego to such a state where the thoughts that plague your progress will essentially fade out because you're connected with that pure will for battle, or the pure will for ego. And the pure will for ego is almost like it's like this flame that burns up everything around it. And when the ego is kind of out of balance, you get all these little thoughts with like whispering in your ear, like all these like other way to do things, or the consequences, or the maybe even the like positive or negative consequences that can come with doing something. But it's this really concept of duality, and you can see this sometimes with like the like angel or demon on like a person's shoulder, that is often depicted. But what it's really representing is this concept of duality within the ego, where it's saying, well, if you do this thing, this is what could happen on this side, but if you do this thing, this is what can happen on this side. But when the ego is in the state where it's in between being fully embraced and in between being in a state of fully released, this is what you get. You get this separation of duality where it doesn't know which direction to go in because it's not polarized enough to one aspect. Ultra ego is essentially giving into the ego to allow it to run freely. So it's almost like a fighter who is now in his element because he is in the ring fighting, and he's not concerned with essentially, let's say, like, okay, the strategy about fighting, or the method in which he's going to win the fight. He's not concerned about technique or strategy or whatever. Not to say he doesn't have it, but he's not concerned with it because he's so enveloped in the active battle itself. So the overarching concept here is, one is complete detachment from the physical, ultra instinct, and the other is complete attachment to the physical, ultra ego. And when you're in complete attachment to the physical, you're in a state where you're enjoying, or so enveloped in the concept of wanting to win, or not even wanting to win, but being the person who has the ability to win and is going to do that because that's in his nature. He wants to fight for the sake of fighting. In and of itself is the concept behind that. So last week we kind of talked about this flow state that is kind of essentially the human or the scientific explanation of, what they describe here as ultra instinct. But when we're talking about ultra ego, you can almost relate this to, let's say, somebody in the gym who gets better as the workout goes on. Like people will talk about like, oh yeah, like Goggins or whatever, right? And they'll say like, oh yeah, he got better as we went through the workout. Like I find like half the time, like, I'll hit another level as I'm doing like pull-ups on the bar or something like that, because it's just like, not only do you get more energy moving through the system, but you taking, what might be termed as damage or whatever, because you're tearing the muscle fibers and letting them regrow. By damaging yourself, you're actually deriving some thirst or bloodthirstiness for battle out of that. So by having that as an aspect, by wanting to fight for the sake of fighting, or the pure nature of doing that thing in and of itself, is the aspect of ultra ego, and that's what kind of brings it to life, and is the main difference between that and ultra instinct. So ultra instinct is the complete ability to surrender and operate from a state of divinity in which you are detached from your ego and just allowing your body to move on its own. When you're talking about ultra ego, you're talking about the ability to connect to everything by having your ego in a state that is so involved. It's completely connected to that thing, so there are no stray thoughts. And even if there is energy that is in conflict with you, it then is lessened over time or enveloped in this energy of destruction, because you are now involving a force in the process which is almost it's negating that force that would impede you now, because you're connecting so much with the state of just doing that thing. So again, like, my best analogy for that would just be somebody who's so connected to whatever sport that they're doing that the concept of winning almost just becomes fused with them. It doesn't become something that they think about anymore. It becomes something that they are. So by becoming that thing that you want to achieve, you are actually like separating the distance between you and that thing. So you can think about it as almost like this is your consciousness here, the thing that is observing your thoughts, all these thoughts floating around here, all around your consciousness or your mind. And, there's a distance between you and this thought. The concept which I'm talking about is shortening that distance to such a degree that it becomes fused with your very state of being. And then essentially you cannot be separated from that thing. And the reason why I wanted to talk about this concept is because this relates to a concept in spirituality of basically complete materialization and dematerialization, complete crystallization and decrystallization. They'll talk about these chakra centers, like the Earth Star chakra, which is the chakra that is actually, it's not even on your physical being. It's like a foot below the ground. It's actually in the earth. And the point of it is that it tethers you to the physical dimension. It is the act of crystallizing the energy, so it acts as a tethering mechanism. They say the universe is fractal, or it's the energy is in some way in some kind of geometrical fixed position, right? So this is this state. It's in a geometrical fixed position. The aspect of light is that it's not crystallized at all. There's no crystalline, there's no geometrical shape. It's just free energy, right? So when we're talking about the state of destruction, it's almost the energy of destruction. It's the ability to undo the former state. It's the ability to undo the crystallization. So, and by undoing that crystallization, as it's shown here, you can pretty much disintegrate anything. But maybe the way to apply this in your life, because we are talking about very obscure concepts here that are very fundamental in nature, and even though they apply to everything in life, it might be hard to, or I should say challenging to see where it can be applied. But for instance, one way you can think of it as relating to, your daily habits, right? If you have something that doesn't serve you, say, well, if I take this thing out of my life, what can I do instead? If I decide that, let's say, trying to think of something that is an unhealthy habit besides like typical thing you might use is like drugs or something like that, but that's not typically something that relates to necessarily consuming a lot of time. But let's say the phone addiction, for example, right? Say if I destroy this aspect of my life by not having that as something that's going to take up, an hour of my time during this segment of the day, what can I apply that time or energy to elsewhere? Maybe I could apply it in the gym, or I can journal, or I can, write my thoughts down, or spend time outside, right? So essentially you're destroying one thing and replacing it with something else, right? So that's energy transference right there. You're taking one thing and destroying it and moving that energy elsewhere and then creating something else from it, right? And the amazing thing is you have the ability to pretty much perform this act with just about anything you can conceptualize, because everything that you can conceptualize has an aspect of destruction to it and an aspect of creation to it. So that is essentially the overarching concept of what we're talking about. And I'll sum up here because this essentially covers the bulk of it. Maybe we'll go to the last image just of Vegeta and we'll sum up with just that. But we see bro's aura glowing up here. So essentially he's able to reach a state called ultra ego, which is akin to Kakarot's ultra instinct. And, essentially he gets to the same destination but using a different path. And that's the overarching concept of what we were talking about here today. There's always two paths: the solar path and the lunar path, the masculine path and the feminine path, the direct path and the indirect path. So there's always two aspects that create that one primary energy. So in an understanding that they both lead to the same place, they can both create and destroy the same things. They just do it in two different sides of the spectrum, is that concept. So this has been Moonstruck right here on Riot Radio. I encourage you to follow us on DC Media Hub and, subscribe to the YouTube channel, subscribe, leave a comment if you enjoyed anything about this video. Check out a new channel, Sword of Mercury, where I talk about some of these concepts in shorter form, and I draw on the whiteboard. So if you prefer more relaxing nighttime content, I encourage you to check that out. And once again, this has been Moonstruck right here on Riot Radio. I'm Ryan, and I'll see you next week.